Well, there are many people throughout the United States who typically will work in, um, filling out the forms and working for the mail system. So that's what I'm talking about. Those who provided the notice of, oh goodness sakes, I forgot what it was. It was the notice of acceptance. That's what it was. And so when I was looking, um, looking for the eligibility notice. So I had taken that, and then those who are eligible and those who are not eligible. So I would look over those, and then I saw that I was looking for the list of my name, and I saw that mine was listed under the not eligible for medical reasons. And I was looking over that, and I looked at the shoes on my feet, and I was walking, and I walked fine, and my body was fine. I was able to bend over, and everything about my body was just fine. I was able to move my hands. My chest was in tip-top shape. Everything is just perfect on my body. And the only thing that I noticed that wasn't working was my ears. And that was the first time that I realized that, I was a little scared to be deaf. And, I was in high school for 3 years. I was working, and I felt that I could do everything except I was deaf, but I didn't have an interpreter. And I went to college for 4 years without an interpreter. But I was able to pass everything, and I was ready to go on with the world, in the real world, but then they flat out told me, no, a deaf person can't do that. So I had, been 9 years to get me to this point, and then they're telling me I can't do it. This caused a lot of terror and panic for me. I became so unsure, as I was reading this letter, and, I picked up the envelope, and I was thinking to myself, I was kind of in shock because, the form had said, hire the Hatskit, and I felt that they were very discriminatory for deaf people. They told me that I couldn't do it. Here I was. I had graduated college, and my wife and I had our first son, so we had a boy, and everybody wants a boy first, of course. But I was going to be in Washington, and for work, and I had applied for all of these government jobs, but they said I couldn't be hired because I was deaf. And I remember them saying that you must be able to hear with at least one ear or without the aid of a hearing aid. And so it was printed there in black and white. That was back in 1960s. That was back in the 1960s in which this was a case. So here I was out of school and just not able to work. And my wife, one of her really good friends, was a senator. And this was, back during the time of LBJ, who was Lyndon B. Johnson. And my friend had told his mother about me, and then they talked with Lyndon B. Johnson, and they heard about my situation and about my eligibility form. So I had submitted it, and LBJ had taken it, and his former secretary had worked in the Navy Department, and notated on it, decide on his ability, not on his disability. So that woman had sent that, and in person, can you imagine? This is the federal government sending me this personal letter that was 3 pages in length, saying that I could go and attend an interview. So I met with the woman, and I had the interview, and the interviewer had a deaf aunt, so was familiar with it. So I waited for 2-3 weeks and before I was able to go. So I had to go in on a trial basis, and I met the director of the office there in the Navy Department, and I sat down with them, and they also had experience with deaf, and they had completed all the interviews and sent it to the Civil Service Commission. And the director, personnel for all of the government facilities in the U.S., they denied my application once again. So we went back and forth, and they had decided that I could go on a 6-month trial basis. And, so I worked under a supervisor who had a deaf aunt, and then I transferred to under 4 different supervisors, and everything was just fine. So once I had worked for those 6 months, they had sent that to the commission and asked me to continue my job. But again, I got the same letter form with the same eligibility saying that due to medical reasons you're not eligible. So they sent me the envelope again, with the same form and all of that. And I went back and forth with them, and the director, they decided to go to the CSC and had gone into the Civil Service Commission, and they went into the room and hire the the handicapped, and then it talked about people who are blind, people who are in wheelchairs, people who had amputations, and they were, hire the handicapped. And then they were saying that, here it was, they were doing it. And I'm like, well, where's your deaf representative? And they're like, deaf people are handicapped, and they were looking around for their representative that is deaf, and they said, well, there's no one. And I'm like, but at me, it looks the same, like I've had experience. And I asked them if they would hire me, and I said, well, here it is, here's my letter. And they said they couldn't hire me because I was deaf, and because the rule said that you must be able to hear in at least one ear. And I said, well, is there any way that we can change that? So I stood waiting. I wasn't going to leave until he told me that it was okay. So he said that it was okay. They would have to change the rule, and you know how the government process usually is. It is extremely slow. And I'm like, no, I'm not leaving until you get this approved now. So they worked on it, and at the same time, NASA was preparing to set up an agency for sending the rockets, and they needed engineers, and, they had to be able to hear. And, so they looked at my case and they said, they were in a hurry, let's go ahead and change the ruling. And so they did, and then in 2 weeks they had changed everything. And nowadays I think it's still that they've changed the rules. That's the fastest one they've done. And can you imagine, it was done in 2 weeks, and I was able to get hired on in a permanent position, which was a great achievement.